I just bought this V8 motor out of a Fox body Mustang, and I'm going to be swapping it into my 1985 Toyota pickup. But why pull out the legendary and super reliable 22R motor that's been in this truck for over 260,000 miles?
And more power, baby!
I really wanted to add a supercharger and Holley EFI to this truck, but that would have cost me around $6,000 to do, and I probably would have only gained about 40 horsepower. This Ford 5.0 high output motor in stock form makes 225 horsepower and already has some really nice upgrades, like this MSD distributor, shorty headers, and a Ford B303 camshaft. I'm not a huge Ford guy, but I do like the fact that they put the distributor in front of the engine, making it easier to adjust timing and fit in this engine bay. So follow along as I get this motor rebuilt and ready to swap in. This is the 5.0 Mustang motor that is going into my Toyota pickup. And I was not planning on tearing it down all the way, but I am sure glad that I did. The original plan was just to disassemble and reseal this engine because the previous owner claimed that it was a good runner. But this engine was just covered in oil, telling me it was either old, wasn't sealed correctly, or just driven hard. There was also some fire extinguisher residue from being in a small car fire. My favorite tools for any disassembly is my plastic bags, a marker, as well as an impact wrench. This one was a gift from my girlfriend. She got it for me after I told her it would help me work faster so that I could spend more time with her. Taking the heads and rocker arms off, I noticed a few of the valves were mushroomed, but that's okay because I plan on using aftermarket heads. Pistons had also been bored 40 over. The previous owner told me that there was a B303 camshaft in this engine, but after pulling out the cam, it revealed some worn can bearings and that the camshaft was actually a E303 camshaft, which is okay because the cam has slightly more lift. I plan on reusing this cam and the roller lifters because both of these together is like $800. Flipping the engine over to remove the oil pickup and pump revealed some very interesting things. The pickup gasket was improperly installed and blocking off half the oil flow, which probably explains all the wiped main and rod bearings. But that's okay, because after a few block modifications, this is getting dropped off to the machine shop to get bored 60 over, decked, and brand new bearings all around. This is the 5.0 Mustang motor that is going into my Toyota pickup, and today I'm going to show you how to make your engine block lighter, stronger, and better for free. Most engine blocks are cast in sand, which leaves a lot of casting flash and imperfections. These rough edges and casting flash are all stress points where cracks can form, so I'm using a carbide bit to grind down all these imperfections. I make sure to go over the entire block, removing all flashing and roughed areas. I also chamfered the sharp corners on the machine surfaces to make this block easier to handle. Besides cleaning up the outside of the block, I'm going to improve oil flow by gasket matching where the oil pump bolts to the block and chamfering where the oil flows into the filter. I also smoothed out these oil drain holes in the lifter valley. Flipping the block over, I cleaned up the water passages, removing the rust and calcium buildup. And this block is looking so much better. It is now lighter, stronger, and better, and is now on the way to the machine shop to get worked on. My 5-liter Mustang motor is back from the machine shop, and this motor is going into my 85 Toyota pickup. And today I'm going to paint this engine to make it look like it came straight out of an anime. I've been seeing these anime car paint jobs everywhere, but I've never seen anyone paint an engine like this, so I'm going to give it a try. And I know I look like I watch anime, but I don't, so don't ask me any anime questions. I'm first hitting the block with a torch to burn off any oils and moisture on the surface. I then bolt on the timing cover and oil pan that I had previously prepped and primed. To mask off the deck, I have these spare head gaskets that I'm just taping to the block. After the block is primed and painted Old Ford blue, I wanted to try painting a small portion of the block first to get an idea how this would turn out. So I painted a freeze plug gold and then used this black marker to highlight all the hard edges. And this area is too small to get an idea how this would look, so I tried painting one whole side. And honestly, I didn't think this was looking too bad till I got to the timing cover and water pump where there's just too much detail. But here's where I decided to give up and just paint it all blue. I guess there's a reason why you don't see any anime painted engines. I'm swapping this 5-liter Mustang motor into my 1985 Toyota pickup, and I need custom motor mounts. Northwest Off-Road used to make these mounts that would allow me to bolt the 5-liter right in, but after 40 years in business, they are closing down. I asked them if they'd be willing to sell their CAD drawings to me, but they said no. But luckily they still had this picture posted on their website, so I'm going to reverse engineer this photo and make my own. I designed this bracket in Fusion 360 and then got these parts laser cut from 316 steel. I designed these tabs to fit into this base, but there's some burrs causing some fitment issues. So after deburring everything, I also chamfered this bottom edge so that I can weld the tab in from the back. And because I can't afford a fabrication table, I'm doing all my welding on this piece of MDF that luckily only caught fire once. After tacking everything, I fully welded it, and I don't know who said I can't TIG weld, but I'm pretty happy how these came out. These plates get bolted to the bottom of the engine, and this will get welded to the bushing, but I can't do that till the old 22R motor is out, which I'll be taking out soon. I'm swapping this Ford 5-liter Mustang motor into my Toyota pickup, but before I pull the 22R motor, I wanted to see how much horsepower this 270,000 mile 4-cylinder engine has. This is the original 22R motor that came with the truck in 1985. It still has the stock short block, stock intake and carburetor, an eBay head and cam, and the only performance part is the air filter and LC Engineering long tube headers. Oh, and the red valve cover definitely adds 5 horsepower too. But I'm guessing this truck is going to put down about 60 horsepower and 90 foot-pounds of torque. Lock in your guesses in the comments and let me know if you were right. The dyno session cost $175 for 3 pulls, and on the last pull I opened the exhaust cutout and it was so loud. Each pull they revved the engine to 4,500 RPM, and the first pull made the most torque at 111 foot-pounds at 2,600 RPM. The second pull made the most horsepower at 73 horsepower at 4,300 RPM. And the exhaust cutout sounded great, but I actually lost a lot of power and torque when it was open. But I can't wait to see how much power this 5-liter puts down. This Ford 5-liter Mustang motor is going into my 1985 Toyota pickup. Last week I pulled the original 270,000 mile 22R motor out and pressure washed the engine bay. I made these motor mounts in a previous video, but before I can mount them to the Toyota frame, I had to bend these tabs down. With the help of my dad, the motor went in relatively smoothly. I only scratched the firewall and engine once. I wanted to weld the rest of the mounts together, but my dad suggested installing the transmission first to make sure everything was straight. After the transmission was bolted to the engine, the transmission mount was really close to the factory Toyota mount, so I ended up drilling the original mount and bolting it directly to the transmission. The oil pan was pretty close to this cross member, so I cut these 3/16 spacers and plug welded them to the bushing sleeves. After the bushings were back into the truck, I used my TIG welder to tack them to the upper mount. I then pulled them out to fully weld them. I also decided to repaint the frame, where some surface rust had formed over the years, and then immediately dropped the flywheel on it. The motor mounts got fully welded, gusseted, and painted black, and the motor can go back into the car. It was definitely a thrash getting this motor in. My dad is going out of town for a month, so I needed to get this done today, and I definitely couldn't have done it without his help. But this 302 looks so good in this engine bay, and I'm happy how it mostly fits. I just gotta figure out how to mount the radiator. I swapped this Ford 5-liter out of a Mustang into my Toyota pickup, and the transmission I am using is a Ford T5 5-speed manual transmission that came out of the same Mustang. After installing the transmission, the shifter is pretty close to the original hole, but I like my shifter a bit more forward. Even the stock Toyota shifter felt a bit too far back for me. So I ordered this White Lightning Street Rod Edition shifter from American Powertrain. This moves the shifter 7 inches forward, and mocked up, this feels way better to me. I pulled out the bench seat and cut away some of the vinyl floor, then traced the outline of the shifter onto the floor. I used this straight edge to measure an inch off the shifter for my cut line, and I'm going to be cutting a large portion of the floor, and I want to make an access panel to cover everything once the shifter's in. I was going to make this panel out of metal, but I wanted to try my hand at fiberglass first. So don't judge, this is my first time using fiberglass. I drilled the corners of my cuts first, then used my 3-inch cutoff wheel to connect the holes. The shifter would be ready to bolt in, but someone had previously stripped out one of these bolt holes. So after drilling, tapping, and threading in a helicoil, the shifter can go in. And this shifter looks so good in this truck, and the shifter placement is perfect. I can't wait to be shifting this truck down the street. I swapped this Ford 5-liter out of a Mustang into my Toyota pickup, and I want this engine bay to look as clean as possible to highlight this engine. The one thing that's always getting in the way is this factory hood strut. So today I'm installing this set of Spikers Engineering hood struts for 4th generation Toyota 4Runners. And this kit is really nice and comes with all the hardware you need to install this onto your truck. The install was super simple, the instructions are easy to follow, and it took me only about 20 minutes to install. And what's really nice is that this kit doesn't require any drilling. And with the help of these gas struts, the hood goes up and down super easily. And this looks so good on my truck. I can now remove this old strut. Again, these hood struts are from Spikers Engineering. I've tagged them in this post, and they make a variety of aftermarket Toyota parts and hood struts for many different years and models. So definitely check out their website if you're trying to update your Toyota. I swapped this Ford 5-liter out of a Mustang into my Toyota pickup, and I'm using the T5 manual transmission out of the same Mustang. The Mustang used a clutch cable to actuate the throwout bearing, but I'm going to be using this hydraulic throwout bearing from McLeod Racing. The instructions recommend a 3/4 bore master cylinder, so this stock Toyota Master is a bit too small. So instead, I'll be using this 3/4 bore master cylinder from Willwood. And I hate cutting and drilling original sheet metal unless I have to, so I designed this adapter and cut it on the water jet. This allows me to use the factory mounting location to bolt on this Willwood master cylinder. I did have to drill out the center hole a bit to clear this rubber boot on the Willwood, and of course my measurements were slightly off and I did have to notch the back of my adapter. I'm reusing the pivot off the Toyota Master Cylinder, but it has metric threads, so I drilled out the threads and welded a standard nut to it. I did also have to clearance a bit off the new master cylinder, but this looks so good in the truck. I started attaching the AN4 lines, but it looks like I ordered the wrong banjo bolt, so I'll order a new one and get this plumbed. The new banjo bolt has arrived, and after it is installed and the system bled, I can test the pedal. And it looks like my math was slightly off. The throwout bearing isn't getting enough fluid to actuate all the way, so I guess I need to order a different one. When you swap a V8 into an 80s mini truck, you run into a couple fitment issues. I swapped this Ford 5-liter out of a Mustang into my 1985 Toyota pickup, and this engine is double the size of the original motor. The first and easiest fitment issue was this oil breather. It was hitting the firewall, so I swapped the PCV valve to the back and the breather to the front. Next was the oil filter. It's too tall and hitting the motor mount, so I'm going to install this 90-degree oil filter adapter. The final issue is this valve cover is resting on the parking brake cable housing. I was thinking about swapping to a stamped steel valve cover and denting the corner in, but I have to keep these vintage Mickey Thompsons. I unbolted the housing and wanted to move it up to where the old speedometer cable was, but the brake cable was too short. So I ordered this longer brake cable for a 2004 Toyota Tacoma, which is slightly longer than the pickup one. It's great keeping Toyota parts in a Toyota. I cut a block-off plate for the old housing location and drilled new mounting holes into the firewall. I also had to modify the parking brake pull handle and this plastic AC duct. But once everything is tightened down, I can test it out. And it works perfectly. And this looks so much better, and there's so much clearance around everything. In my next video, I'll be addressing the cooling system. I absolutely hate working on exhaust systems, but I gotta help this 300 horsepower Mustang motor breathe. This is my Ford 5-liter swap Toyota pickup, and these shorty headers that came with my engine don't fit. So I ordered these stock replacement ones from Doran, and the driver's side fits perfectly, but the passenger side is hitting the upper control arm. So I shelled out the big bucks and ordered these high performance cast iron exhaust manifolds from Scott Drake, and these look really nice. They're very slim and will definitely flow pretty well. The passenger side now fits, but I'm now having fitment issues with the driver's side. The manifold is too close to the block and hitting my custom motor mounts. So I used the hoist to support the engine and pulled out the driver's side motor mount. After a lot of trimming and re-welding, it can go back into the car. While the engine hoist was out, I also decided to push the engine as far back as I could and moved it about half an inch back. Every bit helps when fitting this radiator, and the exhaust manifolds are tight to the frame but fit. I ordered the exhaust tubing from Amazon, and this came with a sorted box of 2 1/4 mandrel bent steel exhaust tubing. After a bit of grinding and welding, the exhaust is made. 2 1/4 exhaust pipes joined to a 2 1/2 exhaust Y, right where the old catalytic converter used to mount. So the back half of this exhaust manifold is stock Toyota. I just have fuel and wiring left to do, and then I can hear how this exhaust sounds. If you don't like seeing cars cut, you probably shouldn't watch this. This is my Ford 5-liter swap Toyota pickup, and it needs surgery to fit this cooling system. The radiator I'm using is from KKS Motorsports and is made to fit Toyota pickups, but there is too little room to mount the radiator in the stock location. So I pulled off the bumper, grille, and valence to see if I can mount the radiator in front of the core support. I also removed the hood latch because it's in the way, And this is obviously a race truck and gonna get hood pins. But now that the front end is bare, I can get an idea of how to mount everything. And this core support is definitely gonna have to get cut. But before I cut anything on the truck, I'm gonna cut the brackets off this radiator. These are gonna have to get modified and relocated eventually. Now for the painful part. This top part of the core support has to go. Does anyone want a souvenir from this build? The radiator is getting caught on the crank pulley, so I removed it, and this radiator fits nicely in here. But this serpentine belt is going to have to get downgraded to a V-belt to save space. I also have to make room for the electric fans going on this radiator, so I'm cutting the lower cross member. But don't worry, I'm replacing it with this piece of channel iron. But before I cut or modify anything else, I'm going to wait for the new front accessory drive and the electric fans to arrive. This is part 2 of fitting a cooling system into my Ford 5-liter swap Toyota pickup. Last time I cut the truck's core support in half and still had fitment issues. The radiator was hitting the crank pulley, so I ordered this new slimmer V-belt kit from CVF Racing, and just look at the height difference of the crank pulley. After it's installed, I also have to attach this pusher fan to the radiator. I did make these tabs with pressed-in studs, but I wasn't able to use them, so I had to use the push-through zip ties that came with the fan. I also had to trim a bit of the fan shroud to get it to sit flat. With the fan mounted, I also had to notch a bit of this frame, but don't worry, it should be just as strong as stock. The fan and radiator fits nicely now, but it's really tight against the water pump, so I replaced it with the shorter one, also from CVF Racing. Remember the original radiator mounts that I cut off in part 1? After some trimming, they get welded back to the radiator, and I am absolutely terrible at welding aluminum, so good thing I painted it all black. And to add some rigidity back to this core support, I made this cross member that connects the two halves together. After the hoses are made and connected, the cooling system is complete. I hope this video gets a lot of views, because this aluminum tube was expensive. I swapped this Ford Mustang 5-liter into my Toyota pickup, and to connect this Ford T5 transmission to my Toyota rear end is this custom 3-inch thick aluminum drive shaft. The pickup originally came with a 2-piece drive shaft, but for simplicity I wanted a 1-piece. And for a longer drive shaft you need a thicker stock, which comes with higher prices. And because I don't want to lose too much horsepower spinning a heavy steel drive shaft, I opted for an aluminum shaft, which is a lot more expensive. The drive shaft shop did a great job making this. I gave them the old drive shafts and the measurements from the rear end to the transmission seal, which is 61 inches. The cost of this drive shaft was $900. The current rear end in this truck is a Toyota 7.5 inch with 373 open gears, which is perfectly fine for the 4-cylinder motor, but I do plan on upgrading to either a Toyota 8 inch or a Ford 8.8 out of Explorer, whichever one is cheaper and more available. And pro tip guys, if you are doing a motor swap, don't forget to grab the transmission slip yoke. This is my Ford 5-liter swap Toyota pickup, and today's the day you've all been waiting for. I'm going to attempt to start this engine and get it broken in. Fluids are added and checked, and after the coolant is added to the radiator, I bypass my temperature switch to make sure the radiator fan works correctly. I also bypass the oil pressure safety switch to trigger the fuel pump. While priming the engine with oil, I noticed the oil pressure gauge was stuck between 12 and 13, so it looks like I have a bad sending unit. But luckily, I did have this mechanical gauge sitting around, which works perfectly. After making sure the truck was in neutral, I got my dad to help crank the engine while I adjusted timing and kept an eye on the oil pressure gauge. After some failed attempts and a backfire through the carburetor, I realized the distributor was backwards. Then after a bit of timing adjustments, the truck started right up. And there's this terrible screaming noise. I'm pretty sure it's the alternator. This was the old one that I had laying around from another project, so this needs to get replaced. To properly break in a motor, as soon as you get it running, you need to get the RPMs between 2000 and 2500 and run it for 20 minutes. The tach on the truck says 5000 RPMs because it was made to read signals from a 4-cylinder engine, so the readout is double with this V8. After 20 minutes of runtime, the engine is broken in and the oil and filter needs to be changed. But now this truck is one more step closer to being on the road. I just need to order a new alternator, clean up a few things, and change this clutch master cylinder. But hopefully next time you see this truck, it'll be on the road. The forbidden potato chip. I got my Ford 5-liter swap Toyota pickup running last week, but after the 20-minute break-in, I found out I need to order a few parts. While I wait for the parts to arrive, I'm going to tackle some of the things inside of the truck. First thing that has to go is this vinyl floor. It's done a great job protecting the floor, but it's definitely time for an update. Next, I'm spraying some degreaser and hosing down the entire floor to get rid of almost 40 years of built-up dirt. And I was really surprised to see how much sand is under here. When I pulled out the flooring, most of it came out, but a bit of the fabric dampening got stuck to the floor.
Brother,
Luckily it stuck to the factory sound editing, so I'm gonna try this dried ice trick to remove it. And I also had no idea how expensive dry ice was. Looking like a hoth battle right here. After all the sound editing was out, there was a bit of rust underneath it, so I wire wheeled the area and brushed some Pour 15. I did make this fiberglass cover for the shifter hole, but I didn't really like it, so I made this one out of some steel I had laying around. The seat can now go back in, but these seatbelt straps definitely need to get remade. Luckily, I know a local and pretty decent upholsterer. My truck hits the road for the first time. Well, sort of. I swapped this Ford 5-liter out of a Mustang into my Toyota pickup, and last time you saw this truck, I had just broken in the motor and it was screaming. I narrowed the issue to a bad alternator, which I replaced. I also had to replace the clutch master cylinder to a 1-inch bore because the 3/4 inch bore didn't move enough fluid volume. The pedal is now super stiff, but the hydraulic throwout bearing fully actuates. I did also notice a small coolant leak from this bypass hose, so I replaced it. And the head studs are also leaking. Maybe I forgot to add sealant to the bottom of the bolts. So I drained the coolant and removed the head stud. And guess what? I'm not crazy. I did actually put sealant on the bottom of the bolts. So I ended up retorquing the head bolts and hopefully they don't leak. The truck started right up, and after a bit of timing and tuning, she was ready to get on the road. The hood doesn't close all the way anymore, so I took it off, and to monitor oil pressure, I zip tied this oil pressure gauge to the vents. And this truck is so fun to drive. It definitely feels like a Mustang, but a lifted one. I was a bit worried about overheating because I did have to get the block board 60 over, and the Radiator was designed for a 4-cylinder engine, but the temperature never got over 175. There's still so much more that I have to do for this build, but thank you all for all your support and patience so far. Oh, and the head studs still leak. Having accurate gauges in a vehicle is super important. I swapped this Ford 5-liter into my Toyota pickup, and only 3 of the 6 factory gauges work now. The tach, fuel, and voltage still work, but to monitor oil pressure, I have this mechanical gauge zip tied to the hood. For water temp, I have this 3-in-1 gauge from Speedway Motors, and for speed, I kind of just guess. And I'm pretty sure I can get all these sensors to work with the factory dash, but I want to do something a bit more custom and modern. So I ordered this set of autocross gauges from Classic Instruments, and they look so nice and will definitely fit the look I was going for with this truck. They come packaged beautifully and with all the sending units you need. To mount the gauges in the dash, I need a donor instrument cluster. But don't worry, I'm not going to be using this upgraded factory one that I currently have in the truck, but instead I'll be using this lower trim one that my dad had laying around. After disassembling it completely, I took some careful measurements, then designed this panel in Adobe Illustrator. And once printed, I can compare the spacing of the gauges and make sure it fits inside the old cluster. Now with some time, a hacksaw, and a lot of patience, I can probably cut this shape out, but I'm pretty lazy, so I'm going to have it sent out in laser cut. So I'll see you in part 2. This is part 2 of adding custom gauges to my Ford 5-liter swap Toyota pickup. Last time you saw this, I had just measured the placement of the gauges and sent it out to get cut. The piece has arrived and fits within the old gauge just like I planned, but there's still a lot of old plastic that's in the way of preventing the gauges from fitting. After marking out the holes, I started cutting out the plastic, and after a lot of cutting and sanding, just a shell remains, which is perfectly fine because we're just wanting the mounting points and a place to glue our new gauge panel. Once the glue is dried, I can start adding the lights and gauges. I then spent the next 2 days wiring up everything. On the truck side, once the old gauges were removed, I can use my multimeter and power probe to find out where all the wires lead to. After crimping on a new connector, I can plug in my new gauge cluster into the dash. A quick cycle of the ignition tells me that everything is working fine. I also had to install a new oil pressure sensor, so this hood-mounted oil pressure gauge can go. And after starting the truck and letting it warm up, everything is working perfectly. It's super nice to have all my gauges in one place and easy to see again. This is the most important part of your vehicle, and if you don't know what this is, you should probably take your car to the mechanic and get one installed. This is a Hurst line lock, and it locks brake fluid to your front brakes so you can do sick burnouts. And my Ford 5-liter swap Toyota is just begging to do its first burnout. So I mounted this line lock on the fender where the old ignition module used to bolt. Now I just need to make the lines to graft this line lock in between the master cylinder and proportioning valve. After removing the old brake line, I used some aluminum welding rod to map out the roots of the new lines. Once I was happy with the layout, I used the welding rod as a template and started matching the bends onto the brake line. I can then use my favorite tool to flare the end, and this would be the perfect flare, but it looks like I forgot to add the fitting. I'm actually super happy how the new brake lines came out. There's perfect 90-degree angles and the lines are perfectly parallel to each other. After a quick bleeding of the brakes and wiring, I can test this out. and it works so well, but sadly this differential is open and only one tire spins in the burnout. I foresee a rear end upgrade in the future. Today, I'm going to show you how to make a carbon fiber hood. This is my 1985 Toyota pickup that I swapped a Ford 5-liter into. And after swapping in an engine that makes triple the horsepower of the stock engine, the nose of this truck has gained 100 pounds and the hood doesn't close anymore. The stock hood was pretty dented and would make a pretty bad mold, so I ordered a new one online and it arrived pretty damaged, so while I wait for a replacement, I cut it up and pinned it to the truck. A few days later, I got the new hood and this one is perfect. I first taped out the sprayer nozzle holes, then applied 2 layers of wax. The carbon fiber cloth was purchased on Amazon and I cut multiple sheets to size. After the epoxy was mixed, I can lay down my first layer of fiber and start spreading. I was using this fiberglass roller, but ended up switching over to a body filler spreader. After 5 layers of carbon, this hood should be plenty strong. I let it cure for a few days and then sanded the surface with 120 grit. I mixed up another batch of epoxy and spread it over the hood. I used the fiberglass roller because the grooves in it allows me to lay an even layer of resin over the whole hood. I popped the small holes using a heat gun and then let the resin even out completely. There's still a lot of waviness in the surface, but that will all get sanded out. And I really wish I had a shop because just look how many bugs already got stuck in this. But I will see you guys in part 2. This is part 2 of making a carbon fiber hood. Last time you saw this, I had laid 5 carbon fiber sheets over the hood and poured a final layer of resin. After a few days of letting the resin sit and harden, I cut the excess carbon fiber flush to the hood, then started to sand the resin completely smooth. This took quite a while because there was a bit of waviness from that last pour of resin. All these small low spots are bug bodies that I picked out, so I did have to go back and fill and sand them smooth. I think quite a few of you missed me waxing the hood before applying the carbon fiber in part 1, but that wax helps me separate the carbon fiber from the steel. After slowly working the edges, the hood pops off. This hood is super light but pretty flimsy. To add back some much needed structure, I'm using the damaged hood that's currently on the truck, grinding the edges till the metal starts to separate. This gets glued to the carbon fiber with some 3M panel bond. It then gets taped and clipped till the 2 halves is cured. This frame adds a lot of rigidity back to the hood, and it still feels pretty light. After spraying a layer of clear, it can finally get installed. This project was a lot of work and I definitely learned quite a bit, but was this hood worth it? The original steel hood weighed 28 pounds, and this carbon fiber hood weighs 16 pounds. Now that's 12 pounds off the nose of this truck, but the cost of just materials for this project was $1,033.75, so about $86 per pound. But let me know what you think in the comments. This is my 1985 Toyota pickup, and even though it makes 300 horsepower and has a carbon fiber hood, it looks like your average work truck and just regular traffic. But today, I'm changing that. I'm installing these 4x4 fenders that are about an inch wider than the stock 2-wheel drive fenders to give this truck a bit more aggressive front end. I painted the passenger side the original tan, but for the driver's side, I wanted to do something a bit different, so I painted it black and added these retro Toyota stripes. I do kind of like the mismatch of colors and textures, part sports truck, part retro truck, and part work truck. After pulling the passenger fender, I can remove all this extra wiring from the old computer and old engine harness. I cut out about a pound of old wires and connectors, and everything seems to still be working fine. With the new fenders on, I can reinstall the bumper fillers, valence, and I also made a little shield to protect the fan motor. For the grille, I found this one online. It might be a bit modern, but I like it. I did have to trim the bottom a bit to clear the fan motor, but after it's installed and wired up, it looks so good. Now my truck is super recognizable and hopefully won't get confused with regular traffic. Yo, check out that rear end. This is my 1985 Toyota pickup, and it's got a 5-liter V8, a 5-speed manual transmission, and is super fun to drive. Now, the only weak point in this drivetrain is the stock Toyota 7.5-inch rear end. So I'm upgrading it with this Toyota 8-inch that is way stronger than that 7.5-inch. Half an inch matters, fellas. I found this on Facebook Marketplace for $300, and it's a pretty nice unit with open 342 gears and a rear brake proportioning valve. But I'm going to be stripping it down completely and upgrading the gears. The 8-inch rear end came in pickups with either a turbo 4-cylinder or a V6, and has the exact same mounting points as the 7.5-inch. After removing both axles, I moved the rear end to some jack stands and cleaned it off thoroughly. Once it was dry, I removed the third member. Now I'm used to these being pretty hard to remove, so I wasn't expecting it to fall out. With the old member out and the mounting surface clean, Here's the brand new third member that I'm installing. A complete Yukon gear assembly. It has 373 rear gears and a clutch posi. After it's bolted on, a coat of VHT satin black makes this rear end look brand new. In part 2, I'll be pulling out the old rear end and installing this one. I definitely should have measured twice when upgrading this rear end. This is my 1985 Toyota pickup that I swapped a Ford 5-liter into, and I'm upgrading the stock Toyota 7.5-inch rear end to an 8-inch. Last time you saw this, I'd stripped down the 8-inch and installed a Yukon gear assembly with 373 rear gears and a posi. Removing the old 7.5-inch and installing an additional leaf spring was super easy, but here's where the issues started. I thought the 8-inch would be a simple bolt-on, but because of that thicker axle, it has a thicker housing, so I can't reuse the stock U-bolts and spring and shock mounts like I planned. So I ordered new bolts and custom fabbed a new spring and shock mount. Once the rear end was secured, I went to install the drive shaft, and it was too long. I knew the third member was a 1/4 inch longer than the 7-inch, and I thought I had enough play in the slip yoke, but I guess with the larger axle housing and that 1/4 inch, it added too much. I called the Driveshaft shop and they told me it would take a week to shorten, but I can't wait that long because I have to get on the road tomorrow. Luckily I have a drive shaft from a 66 Ford Thunderbird that seems long enough, so I swapped the slip yoke and flange to the drive shaft and had to add a 3-inch spacer, but it works. Now 2,300 miles to Nashville.
Whoa. What was that?
This is day 2 of driving my Ford 5-liter swap Toyota pickup cross country. Yesterday we drove 600 miles and ended up in Kingsman, Arizona, where we spent the night. And before we can get back on the road, we have to do some maintenance on this truck. We walked a 1/4 mile to the local parts store to pick up some fluid and parts, and once back we unloaded some tools. And a lot of you were worried about my modified drive shaft with a 3-inch spacer, so I'm tightening these bolts as well as retorquing my U-bolts. While I'm checking the lug nuts, my dad is modifying the engine's PCV system. I just had a breather on the valve cover and we could smell the blow-by when downshifting, so he's rerouting the blow-by gases back to the air cleaner base to be burned off. I'm also replacing the differential fluid because this is a brand new rear end and you're supposed to change the fluid after the first 500 miles. And of course guys, we're professionals and didn't leave a single drop of oil in this hotel parking lot. But now back to the road.